God has a way of when he wants someone to pursue something, he typically allows them to experience it firsthand, so they don't just simply speak theoretically, but they speak from a deep reality, that's experiential. And that's the reality that my wife and I have had, where over the past few years, we both experienced deep levels of trauma. It dates back with my wife. She was disowned by her family when she came to Christ. And so the trauma from that experience matched with the various race-based trauma that came from being a minority at a predominantly white seminary institution, alongside being a minority, specifically a black man with a multi-ethnic background, and within evangelicalism, which is where I've been for the past 15 years. It's been a lot of profound loss and pain that has come from seeking to navigate those waters as a minority. And so we have our own experiences of trauma, race-based trauma, as it relates to the church, as it relates to seminary, as it relates to just simply navigating evangelicalism. Now, as a counselor, I was also, one of my primary fields has been trauma counseling. And I began getting a lot of trauma patients, or trauma counselees, if you would, who all seem to have a similar root. It was something, their trauma, whether it was PTS or whether it was depression or something, it all was rooted back into various racialized experiences that they had, whether in the church or within just the ward in general. And what ended up happening was I just got more and more counselees, and I would pinpoint, hey, what is the base of this trauma? Where is this coming from? Racializations kept coming into the picture. Now, in my biblical counseling degree, I learned nothing of categories of racial pain or any of those kinds of things. And so I didn't really have the biblical counseling categories to do it. But with the trauma background, and then me being African American and studying the history of racialization in America, I kind of brought those two together and came to the conclusion that there is something called racial trauma. I define trauma as haunting pain. It's pain or experiences of pain, whether they be physiological, psychological, emotional, or spiritual, that are not just simply a profound moment of pain, but rather it's pain that is so profound it haunts you throughout life. You carry it with you as you seek to live your life, and so it haunts you as a ghost haunts. It's pain that haunts an individual. And racial trauma is racialized pain. It's pain that is rooted in racialized experiences or background or baggage that moves along with somebody throughout their life, and in a sense, again, haunts them. And so I was receiving all these counselees who had pain, a haunting pain that they were seeking to overcome, and all of it was deeply rooted within racialized experiences that they had within the church, or racialized experiences that they had within the woods, such as police brutality, seeing unarmed black men being killed repeatedly on the news, or hearing someone who's running for president who is espousing racialized speech being applauded by their friends and pastors and all those kinds of things, leaving them just beside themselves. And so again, just different people with different backgrounds all coming saying the root of the pain that has been haunting me for all these years is rooted within the realities of a racialized society in which we live. And how do I overcome this haunting pain that I've experienced by being a person of color, or even white people who have experienced forms of racism and that has been profound? How do I overcome this haunting pain of racism and racialization? One of the things that has been consistent that I've heard repeatedly is the reality of assimilation. That within majority culture churches or dominant culture churches, white churches, there can be an expectation of the minorities who are elevated are those who have been willing to assimilate to predominant culture. And so they're willing to echo the various ideologies of white culture. They're willing to mimic or mirror various cultural expressions of white culture. And those are the ones who are elevated and even given the positions or platforms to speak on behalf of others who have not done so. And so if you're a minority in those spaces who has not assimilated to white culture, it can be especially if you don't realize that that's a dynamic, and that you've been in a context where you believe people are family for many, many years. And then again, this has happened in the past couple of years, you come to a realization, kind of a shock, that even though you saw and perceived these people as family, they always perceived you as less than, or that there was something wrong with you that you needed to change in some way. And the way that you needed to change was a way in which you could not change because it was rooted in your very ethnic identity. And so the kind of the pain or the shock that comes with the reality of, one, my ethnicity is a deep problem. Two, the people whom I have considered family do not receive me fully because of my ethnic and cultural identity. Both of those are certain kind of emotional and even spiritual, because we're talking about the church here, and in many cases even talking about realizations that some have with their pastors, that spiritual authority of a pastor coming and you realizing your pastor feels that way, or the reality of this is my church family, my spiritual family, and this is how they feel. The kind of shock that can cause can result into a haunting pain that haunts someone throughout their life that could lead them. There was an article written recently called A Quiet Exodus that talked about how many minorities, I was interviewed for that as well from the trauma perspective, but how many minorities are leaving the church, and specifically white churches, because of that pain. I would add to that, many are leaving the church altogether. They're becoming so besought where the church itself becomes a trigger, to trauma and to PTS, that they are wanting to stay as far away from the church, any kind of collective body altogether, because of that trauma, because of that haunting pain. And so another example specifically that I would like to mention is that black sisters can often, I wrote an article on this called When the Church Colonizes Femininity, where there can be a ethnic and cultural paradigm within majority culture churches where all women, regardless of ethnicity and culture, are expected to conform to a model that looks like a white antebellum Southern woman, in regards to quiet and speech, mannerisms, speech patterns, all those kinds of things. And so when you take someone whose personality, which is tied to their ethnicity and culture, and you tell them, we need you to be conformed into this, and in order for you to be considered godly, you must be conformed into this. It's a form of spiritual abuse. And when leaders do that, that leads to deep trauma. When counselors do that within the counseling room, because counseling is a very intimate context where people are, in a sense, engaging and expressing and being even more vulnerable than normal, for them to seek to have someone conform to another ethnic or cultural identity than their own within those contexts can be deeply traumatic and deeply hurtful to such a fundamental level that precious saints are even leaving the church for great periods of time because of that, or even being enticed by heresies and cults, because of the level of devastation that they received within Orthodox churches. When it comes to the Marxism, so again, my field is historical theology, so though I do primarily serve the church right now as a Christian counselor, a biblical counselor, my field of study where I've been pursuing degrees has been, my postgraduate degrees has been historical theology, so history is kind of my thing. And when you think about the Marxist charge, I don't think it's as much about ideology as it is about, in a sense of what people who are saying these things believe. So am I a Marxist, a neo-Marxist, a cultural Marxist? No, but I don't really think that's what that's about. I think what it's really about is a failure to understand the conditioning realities of racialized history. And what I mean by that is that America in and of itself is a racialized society. It is a society that is fully bought in to the construct of race, rooted in evolutionary theory. Because that is the construct that America is bought into, it has also developed a racial caste system where you have, and we have this clear throughout history, white versus slaves, or white versus the indigenous Americans, and then you even have Irish and other groups that come who are not considered white, but in a sense inherited whiteness as a means of luring them away from allying with black people. When it comes to the charge of Marxist or Marxism, that is a charge that has been used to silence and discredit marginalized communities within our racialized society for generations. That's the same charge that was made to Dr. King and other civil rights activists. Dr. King is on record. He's written about criticisms about Marxism and how it's anti-Christian. And so, but that's a charge that he frequently gets charged with. But it's not about the ideology. It's as much about silencing, the conversation, and specifically silencing black people by labeling them. And so if we can say that they're Marxists, which is something that is culturally and politically taboo, then we can discredit anybody from actually listening to what they're actually saying. And so I think that there's much that can be engaged and debated about what Marxism is and why not. I honestly, personally, do not desire to take on a posture of having to defend myself from others who are throwing out labels. I don't think that it's a healthy posture to have where black people, specifically black Christians, are having to defend their orthodoxy and defend their faith to people who come from a theological tradition that has oppressed and marginalized them theologically and biblically. So what I would say is, and now what I would press in that conversation is the reality that it's interesting that that same charge is one that has come from segregationists. It's one that has been used by white supremacists, and it's one that has been used by white nationalists for generations and for generations. It's not something new. The social gospel concept is one that, again, I would say the only way that some can come to that conclusion is if they haven't really been listening to people of color. I don't know a person of color that holds to a social gospel view. All the people of color I know who are in the racial reconciliation conversation are people who hold to the concept of imputed righteousness, and they're people who hold to a theology of Christ and his priestly work. So when you think about social gospel, the social gospel believes that the gospel, what Christ achieved on the cross, was the reconciliation and unification of social injustices. Where what I believe and what many others believe is that what Christ has won on the cross, his work, his life and work, has obtained cosmic unification and reconciliation. He is reconciling and unifying the cosmos. The entire universe has fallen because of sin and is in disarray because of sin. And what we read in Revelations is that there's coming a time where God is going to get rid of death. There will be no more weeping, no more sorrow. There will be no more death. There will be no more pain, no more sickness, and all those things. Cosmologically, Christ is unifying everything. That includes social systems. So the gospel is about God reconciling and reconciling humans to himself. But the gospel is also about God reconciling the nations, God reconciling people to one another, God reconciling people within the social systems that they develop. And so that's very different than a social gospel, which is about Christ dying for social injustice, to say that, no, Christ died to save sinners, and in the death that he died and the regeneration that sinners obtained through his death, through faith, you have new creatures who are now operating out of divine love through the Spirit, who are changing the world. The gates of hell will not prevail against them. The nations are being unified. I think that there is a deep need for counseling and soul care within this regard. I mean, we can argue and we can debate theological propositions all day. But the fact of the matter is that even when I think about racial trauma, is that we can't ignore the fact that there have been centuries of psychological conditioning that unfortunately is also plaguing the church. And so there's not just a need for minorities to heal from the trauma that they've received due to racial indifference of their white brothers and sisters. There's also a need of soul care for white Christians to come to terms with their own psychological conditionings and trauma. I think that racism itself is the fruit of insecurity and fear. And so one of the reasons why there are a lot of people who are very apprehensive and very against what I would talk about or what we would engage with regarding racial reconciliation is because fear of Marxism, fear of socialism, fear of social gospel and all these other kinds of things. And so I think fear and insecurity is very much there. But I also think that there are patterns of speech and patterns of thought, such as doubting minorities, questioning or seeking to police minority thought. There are various things and patterns that exist that are being perpetuated due to racialized conditioning that has happened over the centuries. And I think the church, in order to move forward, is reconciling that, is getting to the real deep heart issues behind why do I think this way? Why do I fear you? Why am I othering you? And I think that once we really get to the heart issues behind these things and actually provide soul care for individuals, we can have a church that is not just simply saying the right things, but a church that is truly a family, truly walking in love and unity, and walking and seeking understanding, and to be of one mind and one body and one faith. And so I would say that my vision in the future is a church that is not just simply colorblind. I don't think that's healthy. I don't desire a church that is simply just put a Band-Aid on issues. I want a church that has worked through the deep and pervasive ideas that have stirred up fear and suspicion in one another, so that we can be a unified body and be a light to the world that is still struggling to come to terms with the racializations that have plagued this country.